Hey guys, tonight we begin with something extraordinary. The raw, stubborn resilience of medieval peasants who survived some of the coldest, most brutal winters in human history. We're talking about people who faced temperatures that would send you running for your thermostat, except they didn't have thermostats, or central heating, or, honestly, much of anything except determination, creativity, and a willingness to sleep next to a cow. Before modern insulation, before electric blankets, before you could simply crank up the heat and complain it's still too cold, ordinary people had to outsmart winter using nothing but mud, straw, animal dung, and sheer grit. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't last 3 nights. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself in the year 1250, somewhere in rural England or France. Winter has arrived, and it's not the picturesque, cozy snow globe version you see in holiday movies. This is the kind of winter that kills. You live in a tiny one-room cottage made from wattle and daub, basically a basket of sticks smeared with mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. The walls are maybe 4 inches thick on a good day, and they're already cracking from last year's freeze. Your window is a small hole stuffed with an old cowhide that flaps whenever the wind picks up, which is constantly. There's no glass. Glass is for bishops and kings, not for you. Inside, the temperature hovers just a few degrees above whatever nightmare is happening outside. If it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit beyond your walls, it's maybe 25 inside. Congratulations, you've earned yourself 5 extra degrees of survival margin. The floor beneath your feet isn't wood or tile. It's just packed dirt, cold and unforgiving, radiating chill up through your thin leather shoes or the rags you've wrapped around your feet. At night, that cold seeps into your bones like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. Your bed, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a wooden frame stuffed with straw or hay. If you're not lucky, you're sleeping directly on a pile of rushes scattered across the dirt floor, layered with whatever old straw you manage to scavenge from the barn. Either way, it's crunchy, it's lumpy, and it's teeming with fleas, but it's better than nothing. Barely. The straw provides a thin barrier between you and the frozen earth below, though barrier might be too generous a word. It's more like a polite suggestion that maybe the cold should slow down a bit before reaching your spine. At the center of your home flickers the only thing standing between you and death, the hearth. It's not a proper fireplace with a chimney. Most peasant homes didn't have chimneys until well into the 14th century. Instead, you have a simple fire pit, maybe ringed with stones, sitting right in the middle of the room. Smoke rises lazily, drifts toward a hole in the thatched roof, and if it's feeling cooperative, some of it actually escapes outside. The rest hangs in the air, stinging your eyes, coating your lungs, turning the interior of your home into a hazy, smoky cave. But you don't complain. That smoke keeps the bugs down, preserves the thatch, And most importantly, it's warm. Historians know that peasant homes were designed for survival, not comfort. Archaeological digs across medieval Europe have uncovered the remains of these humble structures: post holes, hearthstones, layers of compacted dirt floors. What's remarkable is how consistent the design was from England to Poland, from Norway to Spain. Everyone, it seems, arrived at the same brutal conclusion: winter is the enemy, and your house is the front line. Some scholars still debate whether the inclusion of livestock indoors was primarily for warmth or for protection against theft, but the practical result was the same: bodies, human and animal, packed together, generating heat in the only way available. You share this smoky, cramped space with your entire family, your spouse, your children, maybe your aging parents, possibly a cousin who had nowhere else to go. Privacy is a concept that doesn't exist yet. Everyone sleeps in the same room, often in the same bed, huddled under whatever scratchy wool cloaks and blankets you've managed to accumulate over the years. And soon, as the temperature drops further, you'll be joined by even more roommates: your goats, your chickens, maybe even your pig. Because when winter truly bares its teeth, the line between barn and bedroom disappears entirely. This is your reality. This is home. And tonight, as the wind howls outside and the fire sputters its weak, defiant glow, you're about to discover that surviving a medieval winter required more than just endurance. It required ingenuity, cooperation, and a willingness to do whatever it took to see another sunrise. The fire is everything. It's your stove, your lamp, your heater, your alarm clock, and quite possibly your best friend. Without it, you're not just cold, you're dead. And here's the terrifying part: keeping that fire alive through a long winter night is far harder than you might think. You can't just flip a switch or strike a match. Matches won't be invented for another few centuries, and flint and steel fire, starting in freezing conditions with numb fingers, is about as easy as teaching a cat to fetch. So medieval peasants developed a technique called firebanking, and it was nothing short of an art form passed down through generations like a sacred family recipe. As bedtime approached, and bedtime came early because heating your home after dark was expensive and difficult, someone, usually the eldest or most experienced member of the household, would carefully tend to the hearth one last time. They'd rake the glowing embers into a compact pile at the center of the fire pit, then gently cover them with a thick blanket of ash, not too much, or you'd smother the coals entirely; not too little, or they'd burn out before dawn. Just right. The ash acted as insulation, trapping heat around the embers and slowing their consumption of oxygen. If done correctly, those buried coals would stay alive, barely breathing, barely glowing, for 6, 7, maybe even 8 hours. Come morning, someone would shuffle over, still half asleep, poke through the ash with a stick, uncover those precious embers, add fresh kindling, blow gently, and coax the fire back to life. If it worked, you'd have warmth and the ability to cook breakfast without spending an hour creating fire from scratch. If it didn't work, you faced a cold, miserable morning and the very real possibility of freezing before you could get a new fire started. Historians have documented fire banking practices across medieval Europe, finding references in household management texts and religious writings. One 13th century French manuscript advises covering the coals as you would tuck a child into bed, emphasizing the care and tenderness required. But here's where it gets interesting. Some fringe historical theories suggest that certain families developed almost superstitious rituals around fire banking, specific prayers, particular types of ash, oak versus pine, even the direction the coals should face. Scholars still argue whether these were genuine beliefs in magical fire preservation or simply mnemonic devices to help remember the correct technique. Either way, the stakes were life and death. On the coldest nights, fire banking alone wasn't enough. Families assigned shifts. Yes, medieval peasants invented the night watch centuries before modern security guards. Someone had to stay awake, or at least sleep lightly, to check on the fire every few hours. Usually, this duty rotated among the older children and adults. You'd drift into an uneasy sleep, wrapped in your cloak, pressed against your family members for warmth. And then, tap, tap, your brother nudges you awake. Your turn. You'd stumble to the hearth, still mostly asleep, and check the embers. Were they glowing? Did they need more ash? Should you add a small piece of wood now? Or wait? The fire watchers were the unsung heroes of medieval winter survival. A moment of carelessness, a shift member who fell too deeply asleep, and the household could wake to a dead hearth and a cold that would seep into every corner before anyone could stop it. In some villages, neighbors would take turns checking on each other's fires, especially if a family had only young children or elderly members who couldn't maintain the watch. Community survival depended on these small acts of vigilance. And then there was the fuel itself. Wood was precious. Depending on where you lived, forests might be controlled by the local lord, and peasants were only allowed to gather fallen branches, not cut living trees. Peat, compressed, dried plant matter dug from bogs, became a common alternative in places like Ireland and Scotland. It burned slower and smellier than wood, filling the house with an earthy, acrid smoke, but it kept the fire alive. In the coldest regions, families hoarded fuel all summer and fall, stacking it carefully, keeping it dry, knowing their winter survival depended on those piles of wood and peat lasting until spring. You lie there in the darkness, listening to the fire crackle softly, watching the shadows dance across the mud and dung walls. Someone coughs. A child whimpers in their sleep. Outside, the wind shrieks like something alive and angry. But inside, the embers glow, buried safely under their blanket of ash, and you allow yourself to believe that maybe, just maybe, you'll make it to morning, because that fire, that tiny constellation of glowing coals, is all that stands between your family and the frozen oblivion waiting just beyond the walls. When the fire can only do so much, and the walls offer barely more protection than a wet blanket, there's one final defense against the killing cold: each other. Forget about personal space. Forget about your own bed, your own blanket, your own side of the room. In medieval winter, survival meant transforming your family into what can only be described as a human lasagna, layer upon layer of warm bodies pressed together in a desperate, snoring, occasionally flatulent pile of shared body heat. On the coldest nights, the entire household would gather in the warmest corner of the room, usually nearest the hearth, but not so close that someone's cloak might catch fire. Parents, children, grandparents, and yes, even the livestock, all converged into one communal sleeping arrangement. The goal wasn't comfort, it was thermodynamics. Every human body generates heat, roughly the equivalent of a 100-watt light bulb. String enough bodies together, and you've created a makeshift furnace. The more people packed into your sleeping area, the better your chances of waking up with all your fingers and toes still attached. If you were lucky, you got a spot in the middle of the pile. The center was warmest, insulated on all sides by radiating body heat. Parents often placed infants and small children there, recognizing that the youngest were most vulnerable to hypothermia. The elderly, whose bodies no longer generated heat as efficiently, were also tucked into the middle layers when possible. If you were unlucky, you ended up on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to an open refrigerator door. Edge sleepers faced the cold air directly, and they paid for it with numb extremities and fitful, shivering sleep. Historians have found evidence of communal sleeping practices in medieval household records, coroners' reports, and even church documents warning about the dangers of overlaying, accidentally smothering infants when too many people shared one bed. The practice was so common that laws were passed in some regions regulating sleeping arrangements to protect children. But here's the fascinating part. Some scholars argue that this forced intimacy actually strengthened medieval family bonds, creating a level of physical closeness and interdependence that modern families never experience. Others counter that it was simply miserable, stripping away any dignity or privacy, reducing human beings to survival machines. The debate continues. Now, add the animals. Yes, the livestock came inside. Cows, goats, sheep, pigs, chickens. If it had body heat and you owned it, it was sleeping in your house. This wasn't whimsy or affection for farm animals. It was calculated survival strategy. A single cow generates an enormous amount of warmth. Imagine a large, constantly running space heater that also occasionally moves and deposits inconvenient surprises on your dirt floor. The trade-off was absolutely worth it. The animals had their preferred spots too. Cows, being largest and warmest, were often positioned near the sleeping area, sometimes with only a low partition separating them from the human section of the house. Goats, smaller and more agile, would wedge themselves wherever they pleased, which often meant right next to or even on top of sleeping humans. Chickens roosted in the rafters or in baskets, occasionally deciding that your head made an excellent perch around 3 in the morning. Pigs, well, pigs didn't care about anyone's comfort. They flopped down wherever they wanted, snoring almost as loudly as your uncle. The smell was legendary. By midwinter, after weeks of humans and animals sharing close quarters with minimal bathing and no ventilation, the interior of a peasant cottage smelled like a unique combination of unwashed bodies, wet wool, manure, smoke, and desperation. But medieval noses adapted. You stopped noticing after a while, or at least you pretended to. Besides, everyone smelled exactly the same, so there was no social stigma. Nose blindness became a survival skill. Some fringe historians have suggested that the presence of animals indoors may have had unexpected health benefits, exposing families to diverse bacteria and building stronger immune systems. Others point out that it also spread diseases, parasites, and created sanitation nightmares. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. But one thing is certain: when you're facing death by freezing, you'll gladly share your bedroom with a flatulent goat if it means seeing another sunrise. So there you are, wedged between your snoring father and a particularly warm sheep, your little sister's elbow jabbing into your ribs, a chicken clucking softly overhead, and the cow chewing its cud just beyond the partition. It's not comfortable, it's not dignified, but as the bitter wind howls outside and the temperature plummets, you feel the collective warmth of your makeshift family fortress, and you understand. This ridiculous, smelly, crowded arrangement is exactly what survival looks like. And somehow, pressed against all these breathing, living heat sources, you finally drift off to sleep. In the modern world, we wash our clothes regularly, take daily showers, and generally try not to smell like we've been rolling around in a medieval barn. But here's something medieval peasants understood that we've forgotten. In the depths of winter, dirt isn't just inevitable, it's functional. That grimy, grease-soaked tunic you've been wearing for 3 months straight, it's not a fashion disaster. It's a survival tool. Let's start with the basics. You own maybe 2 or 3 garments total: a linen undershirt, a woolen tunic or two, possibly a cloak if you're fortunate, and some leg wrappings that charitably might be called pants. That's your entire wardrobe. And in winter, you wear all of it simultaneously. Layering isn't a style choice. It's the only defense you have against temperatures that want you dead. You pull on your undershirt, then your tunic, then another tunic over that, then your cloak. And if you've managed to acquire or inherit a sheepskin, you throw that on top like a trophy. You now look like a lumpy, waddling turnip. You've also just increased your odds of survival by several percentage points. But here's where it gets interesting. You don't wash these clothes, not in winter, not if you want to live. Washing your garments in January means hauling water from a frozen stream, breaking through ice, scrubbing fabric with your already numb hands, and then waiting 2 or 3 days for everything to dry. If it doesn't simply freeze solid into a shirt-shaped ice sculpture first. Most peasants wisely decided this was insane, so the clothes stayed on, unwashed, accumulating layers of dirt, sweat, body oils, smoke, food stains, and whatever else life threw at them. And something remarkable happened. Over time, all that accumulated filth, the natural oils from your skin, the grime from daily labor, the grease from cooking, actually filled in the tiny gaps between the wool fibers. Clean wool is somewhat breathable, which is great in summer, but terrible when you're trying to keep frigid wind from cutting through to your skin. Dirty wool, caked with weeks of bodily secretions and environmental crud, becomes significantly more windproof. The fabric grows heavier, denser, more insulating. You've accidentally created medieval Gore-Tex, and all it cost you was your dignity and any hope of smelling pleasant before April. Historians have documented this phenomenon through both written records and textile analysis. A 14th century English household manual mentions that winter garments should not be washed until spring, specifically noting that the natural oils provide warmth. Archaeological studies of preserved medieval clothing show that worn, unwashed wool has measurably different insulating properties than clean wool. It traps more air, blocks more wind, and retains more heat. The peasants weren't being lazy or ignorant. They were being smart. But here's where scholarly debate gets spicy. Some historians argue that medieval people genuinely believed washing yourself too frequently in winter could make you sick, that removing your body's natural protective oils would leave you vulnerable to cold and disease. Others insist this was simply practical wisdom dressed up in pseudo-medical language, a way to rationalize doing what was necessary for survival. A few fringe researchers have even suggested that certain particularly grimy individuals were considered good luck in winter, as if their ability to accumulate filth proved their hardiness. Whether superstition or science, the result was the same. By February, you were wearing what amounted to a crusty, personalized suit of thermal armor. Children were especially swaddled, wrapped in layer after layer until they resembled small, waddling bundles of fabric with faces peeking out. Parents knew that children lost heat faster than adults, so they packed them with every scrap of cloth available. The kids could barely move, but they could survive, and that was all that mattered. Hats were precious. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between life and death, since you lose tremendous amounts of heat through your head. Gloves, usually hand-sewn from leather scraps or thick wool, were treasured possessions, often passed down through generations. So there you stand, wrapped in multiple layers of increasingly fragrant clothing, your tunic stiff with accumulated grime, your cloak reeking of smoke and sheep, your hat probably housing a small ecosystem of its own. You haven't bathed in months. Neither has anyone else. The smell is apocalyptic, but you're warm, or at least warmer than you would be otherwise. And when you catch your reflection in a bucket of water and see yourself looking like a lumpy, dirty, extremely pungent scarecrow, you don't feel shame. You feel smart, because you've turned filth into function, transformed grime into survival. And that, in the brutal calculus of medieval winter, makes you a genius. As the long winter day fades and darkness swallows the frozen landscape outside, there's one more crucial survival strategy left in the medieval peasant's arsenal: eating. But this isn't about satisfying hunger or enjoying a nice meal. This is strategic eating, calculated consumption designed to turn your body into a furnace that burns through the night. Because here's the thing, digestion generates heat, a lot of it. And if you can pack your stomach with the right foods before bed, you're essentially lighting an internal fire that will keep you warm for hours after the hearth has dimmed to embers. Your evening meal, the main meal of the day, is served just before sunset. It needs to be heavy, dense, and packed with calories. We're talking about thick, hearty stews made from whatever vegetables you managed to grow and preserve through the fall: turnips, onions, parsnips, cabbage, beans. These root vegetables are lifesavers, literally, because they store well and provided sustained energy. The stew bubbles away in an iron pot hanging over the fire, thickening into something that's more solid than liquid, something you could probably stand a spoon up in. If you're fortunate, there's grain, barley, oats, or rye cooked into a dense, chewy porridge that sits in your belly like a warm stone. Bread, if you have it, is dark and heavy, made from coarse rye or barley flour, sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch the grain further. This isn't the fluffy white bread you're imagining. This is bread that could double as a weapon. You tear off chunks and dip them into your stew, soaking up every last bit of precious fat and flavor. Fat is the secret weapon. Animal fat, lard from pigs, tallow from cattle, even goose fat, if you're incredibly lucky, is liquid gold in winter. It's calorically dense, burns slowly during digestion, and provides more sustained warmth than any other food. A spoonful of lard stirred into your stew or smeared across your bread could mean the difference between shivering through the night and actually sleeping. Peasants understood this instinctively, hoarding every scrap of fat they could obtain, rendering it down and storing it carefully for the brutal months ahead. Historians have found evidence of medieval dietary practices in household accounts, agricultural records, and even skeletal remains that show seasonal variations in nutrition. What's fascinating is how sophisticated peasant food knowledge actually was. They understood, without benefit of modern nutritional science, that certain foods kept you fuller and warmer longer. Some scholars argue this knowledge was purely experiential, generations of trial and error teaching families what worked. Others suggest there may have been more formal transmission of food wisdom, perhaps through church teachings or traveling herbalists. The debate continues, but the results speak for themselves. On special occasions, feast days, the winter solstice, or after a successful slaughter, meat might appear: salted pork, dried sausage, maybe even a piece of smoked fish if you lived near the coast or a river. Meat was precious, reserved for moments of celebration or desperate need, but when it appeared on your wooden trencher, you savored every chewy, salty bite, knowing that the protein and fat would fuel your body through many cold nights ahead. The entire family ate together, gathered around the fire, spooning stew from a common pot, tearing bread from a shared loaf. There was something almost ritualistic about this evening meal, not just the act of eating, but the gathering itself, the coming together in the warmth and light before surrendering to the cold darkness of night. Parents made sure children ate their fill, sometimes sacrificing their own portions to ensure the young ones had enough fuel to survive until morning. And then, with your belly full and tight, almost uncomfortably distended, you'd settle into your sleeping spot. Your body would immediately begin the work of digestion, breaking down all those root vegetables, that dense bread, that precious fat. The process generated heat, real, measurable warmth radiating from your core. You could actually feel it, that internal glow, as your body converted food into energy and warmth. It wouldn't last all night, but combined with the banked fire, the pile of family members, the warm presence of livestock, and your crusty layers of clothing, it was enough. Some nights, when you'd eaten particularly well, you'd drift off into vivid, bizarre dreams, your overstuffed stomach working overtime, creating strange visions of feasts and summers and warmth. But you didn't mind the odd dreams. They were a small price to pay for the very real warmth spreading through your limbs, the comfortable weight in your belly, the sense that maybe, just maybe, you'd wake up in the morning with all your body parts still working. Because in medieval winter, that full stomach wasn't comfort food. It was survival fuel, and every calorie counted. Beyond all the practical strategies, the banked fires, the communal sleeping, the strategic filth, the heavy meals, there was something else that carried medieval peasants through the darkest, coldest nights. Something harder to measure, but no less essential. Faith, community, and the quiet strength that came from knowing you weren't facing winter alone. These weren't just survival tactics. They were what made survival meaningful, what kept hope alive when the cold pressed in from all sides. Before crawling into bed each night, families would kneel together on the cold dirt floor, their breath misting in the smoky air, and pray. These weren't elaborate ceremonies or lengthy theological discussions. They were simple, desperate pleas whispered into the darkness. Keep the fire alive. Protect the children. Let us see morning. Medieval peasants prayed to saints who they believed understood their suffering. Saint Blaise, protector against throat ailments and respiratory diseases that killed so many in winter. Saint Nicholas, guardian of households and children. Even local saints whose shrines dotted the countryside, figures who had once been ordinary people and might therefore remember what cold and hunger felt like. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth before sleeping, believing it would protect the fire from evil spirits or simply bad luck. Others marked their doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, creating symbols meant to keep warmth in and death out. Were these superstitions or genuine expressions of faith? Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly believed in the magical properties of holy water and blessed chalk, or whether these rituals served primarily as psychological comfort, a way to feel some measure of control in a world where they controlled almost nothing. Either way, the rituals mattered. They transformed random survival into something sacred, turned mere existence into an act of faith. But faith alone couldn't fill empty stomachs or restart dead fires. That's where community became essential. Medieval villages operated on an unspoken understanding. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else. If your neighbor's fire went out, you shared embers from your own hearth, even if it meant your own family would be colder. If a family ran out of food, the village pooled what little it had. A few turnips here, a handful of grain there, maybe a precious piece of salted meat to keep them alive until spring. Village watchers, usually the young or the elderly who couldn't work the frozen fields, kept informal tabs on every household. They noticed when smoke stopped rising from a particular chimney hole. They saw when someone didn't appear at the village well or the church, and they checked. They knocked on doors, peered through cracks in walls, made sure everyone was still breathing. It wasn't always successful. Winter claimed its victims every year, but this network of watchfulness saved countless lives. Nobody kept official records of these small acts of kindness, but they happened daily, woven into the fabric of medieval village life. Communal food stores played a crucial role too. In some villages, families contributed to shared grain supplies managed by the church or local lord. When individual households ran out, they could draw from this emergency reserve. It was survival insurance, medieval style, imperfect, sometimes corrupted by greedy administrators, but often the thin line between starvation and survival. Some fringe historians have suggested these communal systems were more sophisticated than previously believed, with complex rules about contribution and withdrawal, enforced by community pressure rather than written law. The debate about how organized these systems actually were continues, but their importance is undeniable. Yet for all the ingenuity, all the prayers, all the community support, sometimes winter won. Sometimes families huddled together for warmth didn't wake up. Sometimes the fire went out despite all precautions. Sometimes the food ran out. The cold became too intense. Disease swept through a weakened household, and there was nothing anyone could do. Come spring thaw, neighbors would find them, entire families frozen together in their final embrace, children tucked between parents who had tried until their last breath to share warmth that no longer existed. These tragedies weren't unusual. They were expected, mourned, but understood as part of winter's brutal price. Medieval people lived with death in ways we can barely comprehend. Every autumn, as temperatures dropped, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that some among them wouldn't see the spring flowers bloom. The old, the very young, the sick, the unlucky. Winter took them with grim regularity. Church records from across medieval Europe document the spike in deaths during the coldest months, a seasonal rhythm of suffering that repeated year after year, century after century. But here's what's remarkable. They kept going. They kept banking fires, keep sharing body heat, kept praying, kept watching over each other. They faced each winter knowing the odds, knowing the dangers, and they chose survival anyway. They chose hope. They chose to believe that their ingenuity, their faith, their stubborn refusal to surrender would be enough to carry them through one more frozen night, and then another, and then another, until finally, the first hints of warmth returned to the air, and the earth began to thaw. As you lie there now, safe in your temperature-controlled room, wrapped in your soft blankets, the heater humming quietly in the background, let yourself drift into that world for just a moment. Feel the cold seeping up through straw and dirt. Hear the wind howling outside walls too thin to stop it. Smell the smoke and animals and unwashed bodies pressed close together. And then feel something else. The warmth of your father's back against yours. Your sister's steady breathing beside you. The gentle sound of your mother checking the fire one last time. You're cold. Yes, uncomfortable. Absolutely. But you're not alone. You're part of something bigger than yourself. Part of a community and family and long chain of human resilience stretching back through the centuries. The fire glows softly under its blanket of ash, waiting for morning. The cow shifts and sighs beyond the partition. Outside, snow begins to fall, gentle and silent, covering the frozen world in white. But inside, surrounded by all these breathing, living presences, you feel yourself growing drowsy. Your full belly radiates warmth. Your layers of filthy clothing trap heat close to your skin. And as sleep finally pulls you under, your last thought is simple, grateful, and utterly human. I made it through another day. Tomorrow, I'll do it again. And so, as our journey through medieval winter comes to a close, let yourself sink deeper into your pillows, grateful for the warmth you have, humbled by the resilience of those who came before. Those peasants, with their mud walls and smoking fires and remarkable courage, remind us that human beings are capable of extraordinary endurance when we face hardship together. Their story isn't just history, it's a testament to creativity, community, and the stubborn refusal to surrender even when the world turns cold and dark. So as you drift off tonight, maybe spare a thought for them, those ordinary heroes who survived the impossible, one frozen night at a time. And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. What would you have missed most about modern life? Sweet dreams, and may your own nights be warm, peaceful, and blessedly free of barnyard roommates.